speaker is Catherine Travis, so I'll say a little bit about Catherine and her interests. So Catherine's the Chair of Modern Languages, and she comes from a background originally having studied Japanese and Korean, and then for her PhD she did Spanish, and she's also accredited as a Spanish interpreter. But then she went off to Albuquerque in New Mexico and spent 10 years there. And I'll say a little bit about that in a second. And we were lucky that she came back to ANU a bit over 10 years ago, I guess, and started up all sorts of new things there. And I'm very proud and happy to count her as a colleague there. So what's special about Catherine's research is her ability to assemble vast sound archives of what people actually say and confront this with what the community believes. If you're a linguist, our problem is that everyone knows or thinks they know about what we do. Everyone speaks the language, everyone has opinions about it. Sometimes they're right, often they're not. And we've got to get out there and see what people are really doing with actual data. And that's what Catherine's been doing. Just before talking about her English work, I'd like to mention one important study that she did in New Mexico, where there's an old Spanish-speaking population that was there for centuries, and then has come into contact with English speakers, and who speak both languages or code switch back and forth between the languages, and it had been widely believed and stated that somehow Spanish was going to change because of this, become sort of weakened or something, and show some changes under contact with English. And in this huge study with a colleague, Rina Torres-Capulos, she said, no, that's not happening. Actually, there's this stability there, this strength of holding on to the structures in Spanish despite English contact. And there's a very important lesson for us here when we're interested in Indigenous languages, which are often said to be under threat, and sometimes they are, but we shouldn't automatically be pessimistic. And as we've just heard, there's a resilience there in language that can come back, and we're interested in understanding that, you know, both at the level of people making efforts to bring it back, as you two and other members of the community are, but also just so that we can see what's happening through time. So after that work, and after coming back to Australia, Catherine launched onto this massive project. It's a really, truly monumental project that we're going to be hearing about tonight, about Australian English. And that's a language we all are regularly exposed to. Probably not everyone here in the auditorium would be a native speaker of Australian English, but many people are. Others would have, you know, been confronted with it, either coming here from speaking another English variety or another language and learning English and possibly using Australian English as their target for what they've learned, or possibly not. But to see what's happening, we have to reach back through time. We've got to compare how people are speaking now with how they were speaking in the past, 4 decades ago and more. We've got to look at people's different backgrounds. So there was a pioneering study that we'll hear more about in the 1970s by Barbara Horvath in Sydney that didn't just look at so-called, you know, native speakers, but looked at people who were Italian immigrants into Australia, and Greek immigrants and their children, so that we can trace this sort of flow of many streams into the river of Australian speech and look at the countercurrents and things that are going on there, and lots of sort of things you wouldn't expect, and we'll hear some of them about some of them today. So as this has been happening, I think not everyone could make that sort of research work, and Catherine's been, or is still, you know, is a chief investigator at CoEDL, and she's able to muster, you know, a very fine ear. That's something you've got to have to do this work. You've got to notice things yourself that are going on. You've got to be incredibly organised to bring all of this data together, and you've got to have the ability to get other people to work with you in a systematic way. You've got to be always on the lookout for new technology and how it can help you crunch through more data, and you've just got to have the sort of humour and ability to lay down those roads with the communities that you're working with, and Catherine's demonstrated all of those qualities in spades, and it will come through in tonight's talk. Started off in the Sydney Speaks project, and then has been broadening out to broader issues in Australian English, which isn't the same everywhere it's spoken. You may or may not pick us as coming from the same Australian city. Can you do that for every city in Australia? Probably not. Maybe for some. That's something that's part of this whole project. So what this is going to tell us about, and there's not too many places in the world where this sort of detailed research has been happening, is the way that every language has a life, a complex life, that's bringing in people from different backgrounds, different currents all the time. We've got emerging forms that are going on. I remember when I was a kid growing up, if you listen to the radio, the announcers tried to sound like, I could say poems maybe, but they were Australians, but that's what they oriented to in a formal setting. And that won't happen now. That's because there's been a change in the sort of standards of Australian English. But then there's all sorts of other groups coming in now that weren't there, weren't coming in, 40, 50 years ago. So part of the work that Catherine's doing, we'll also hear about this, is going back to people who were recorded in the 70s and chasing them up and asking them if they consent to talk now, so that the way they speak in the year 2020 or thereabouts can be compared with the way they were speaking then. So we can see part of the change is each generation speaking a bit differently, or different sectors of the population speaking a bit differently. Part of the change may be people adapting how they talk in the course of their lives. So that's enough from me. Catherine will discuss and show the project much better than I'm going to do, and I'd just like to ask you to join me in welcoming Catherine Travis for
Thank you, Nick, for that introduction, and thank you, Auntie Deb and Shania, for that wonderful welcome to country and for warming everyone up for what's to come. So I'm going to talk about 100 years of Australian English, looking from builders to millennials. We all know that languages change over time, and this of course can give rise to new languages. So for example, Germanic gave rise to a number of different languages, including Danish, Norwegian, German, and also English. On the path from one language to another, the same language will undergo many, many changes before it would reach what we might consider a different language. So if we think of some examples from English, some examples that I think you'll all be familiar with from your readings of Shakespeare and so on, we have many instances that we can pull out very easily of change. So for example, English used to have 4 different second-person pronouns with ye, you, thee, and thou, and now that's converged just on a single form. We primarily make use of you. We used to talk of a nadder and a napron, and today we talk of an adder and an apron. So we've had some shift, a loss of that N at the beginning of the word, a reanalysis of what that belongs to. Negation is another really interesting example. So our word today, not, comes from a form naught, which meant nothing. So when we would have said I know naught, it was similar to saying I know nothing. This was then reduced to not, and I know not, this post-verbal not became a kind of standard way of negating. And now we don't do that. We instead introduce a do and stick the not on the end and reduce that, and we end up with I don't know. although the post-verbal not still exists in some constructions, like he loves me not or I think not. So we're familiar with these forms even though they're not widely in use. So this change, of course, doesn't happen overnight. We don't go to bed using you, ye, thee and thou and wake up only using you. It happens gradually and it happens through variation, where we have several competing forms that express generally similar meanings that we use in that same space. We can take the English future as a nice example of the way variation has led to change. So our primary future form used to be shall. Will was originally, it came in as a future form in a way of expressing desire. So when you would say, I will go tomorrow, you were saying, I want to go tomorrow. Over time, that meaning was gradually bleached or generalised so that it took on this future meaning, and will and shall existed side by side. Be going to came into the system from a very different source from will. Be going to came in from what we would call a purposive construction. So I am going in order to see the king. And then this also was bleached of meaning, and we end up with a future form. Today, shall has pretty much dropped out apart from a few limited constructions, and our main competing future forms are will and be going to, which might have some differences but are used very, very similarly. So here we can see how this variation has taken on a path from shall to will to going to. Variation is widespread in language, and I've put some examples up on the slide here. So we can have variation in grammar. So we could say, we hear people saying there are lots of people or there's lots of people. When we want to talk about obligation, we might talk about what I must do or have to, have got to, gotta, need to. Or we can use, with negation, we might use double negation or not. So I don't know anything or I don't know nothing. We also get variation in pronunciation. So we might talk of running and jumping or runnin' and jumpin'. Or we get enormous amount of variation in vowels. So Australian, we can pronounce with very prestigious pronunciation, Australian, but this also gets realised as Australian, and of course then there's the colloquialised strine, which captures nicely this change that this has undergone. And while people will often think, oh, some of those forms are just incorrect, that's just bad pronunciation or bad grammar, as linguists we like to accept different forms that are used, and instead of talking about correct, incorrect, we talk about what's standard and non-standard. So multiple standard and non-standard forms can exist side by side. In some cases, the variation can be very long-lasting. It can be what we call stable variation. And this is the case for the runnin' and jumpin' and also for the double negation, which have existed for centuries. And in other cases, variation can be indicative of change. So we have variation as a path to change, and this is something that I'm going to talk about in detail tonight. Some people are very concerned about variation and change, and they see this as the deterioration of language. This is particularly so of language purists who adhere to what we might call a standard language ideology, which Libby Green has described as a bias toward an abstracted, idealised, non-varying spoken language that is imposed and maintained by dominant institutions. And this standard language ideology is very widespread. So we find it among academics such as Yunsen, who asks, can we not spare 1/100th of a second of breath to pronounce words correctly? In the plain English movement, we hear these kinds of concerns. There is a worrying trend of adults mimicking teen speak. They're using slang words and ignoring grammar. Their language is deteriorating. Our language is flying off at all tangents without the anchor of a solid foundation. From broadcasters, we also hear this kind of commentary. There are so many threats to the survival of good plain English that it is not easy to be optimistic. Ultimately, no doubt, we shall communicate with a series of grunts, and the evolutionary wheel will have turned full circle. Now, these kinds of comments suggest that there was an earlier time, usually 1 or 2 generations ago, when English was pure, was perfect, was proper English that we should be speaking today. But in fact, when we look back in time, we find that these kinds of comments have always existed. So going back some 70 years to George Orwell, he was very concerned about this. He found our civilization to be decadent and our language must inevitably share in its collapse. Going back another couple of hundred years, Jonathan Swift was also very concerned about this and wrote a letter saying, "I do here complain to your lordship that our language is extremely imperfect, that its daily improvements are by no means in proportion to its daily corruptions, and the pretenders to polish and refine it have chiefly multiplied abuses and absurdities, and that in many instances it offends against every part of grammar." We can go back further in time. Putnam, an English literary critic, talked of strange terms of other languages and many dark words and not usual nor well-sounding, though they be daily spoken in court. So talking about borrowings from other languages, which was also a great threat to the purity of English. And Higden, in the 14th century, a Benedictine monk, noted that by intermingling and mixing, first with Danes and afterwards with Normans, in many people the language of the land is harmed, and some use inarticulate utterance, chattering, snarling, and teeth gnashing. So rather than judging change, what we are interested in as linguists is how change takes place. So of course any speaker can produce an innovation, but that is not actually a change in the language until it has spread across a community of speakers. And these are the kinds of questions that I'm going to be addressing today. How do we know if we have variation that this represents a change or it's a case of stable variation? Who leads in change? Who lags? Who initiates? Language change happens very gradually, so it can be very difficult to observe. We can observe it longitudinally in what we would describe as real time if we have samples of language from different time periods. But it's been shown from work in sociolinguistics that we can also observe language change synchronically by comparing across age groups in what we call, using the construct that we refer to as apparent time. So this is based on the idea that adults are relatively fixed in their speech. So once we get to about 20, our speech doesn't change terribly much. So the way somebody speaks at the age of 40, 60, 80 is reflective of how the language was spoken 20, 40, 60 years ago. And younger speakers, on the other hand, represent newer forms of the language. And this construct has been shown to be very robust and has been widely used in linguistic research. In Australia, we're in the fortunate position of having recordings of Australians over different generations that allow us to track change. So today we're going to look at speech of Australians across these generations, ranging from beginning with the Federation generation and coming up to Generation Z, but with a particular focus on the builders, who are those who grew up during the Depression and World War II, and Millennials, who are those who saw in the 21st century as young adults. There's been a lot of social change, obviously, that's happened over these 100 years, and I'm going to take you through some main events that particularly we might be interested in as linguists that might have some impact on the way people speak. So in 1901, Australia secured nationhood. In the 1920s, so when the Federation generation would have been growing up, secondary school at this point, secondary education was very much a privilege, very few people went, and it was primarily directed at boys. Our population was very much Anglo-Celtic, and 80% of migration at this time was from the UK. World War II brought about much social change, but one of the changes that it brought about was greater participation of women in the workforce that did a lot to change the standing of women in society. The baby boomers witnessed the post-war migration period, which saw large numbers of migrants from Europe coming into Australia, and Generation X saw further diversity with the end of White Australia policy, resulting in much more diverse migration, in particular from Asia. A change that has greatly affected Generation X and Millennials and everyone up to today was the abolition of university fees that made higher education much more accessible across the society. And today we have a highly diverse society, with 51% of Australians having at least one parent born overseas and 21% speaking a language other than English at home. To study language over this time, we use collections of recordings of speech, and today I'm going to present data from two such collections that are actually three such collections that are the focus of the project that I'm doing. So firstly, we have data that was recorded in the 1970s and 80s where 3 age groups were represented. The oldest speakers are who are referred to as elderly adults, and these speakers were recorded in 1988 as part of the Bicentennial Oral History Project. And this is our Federation generation. They were born around the 1900s. Then we also have adults and teenagers who were recorded at just slightly earlier, but in a similar time period, as part of Barbara Horvath's Sydney Social Dialect Survey. And these are builders and baby boomers and some Generation X. So these are the earlier recordings that I'll be talking about. We're also collecting contemporary recordings that make up the Sydney Speaks project. And here we have 2 age groups, adults and young adults. The adults, again, are baby boomers and Generation X. So notice that this is the same generation as the teenagers, but recorded 40 years on. In some cases, it's the same speakers. In most cases, it's a different group of speakers, but it's that same generation. And young adults who are mostly millennials and some Generation Z. So these groups then allow us to test for change both in real time and in apparent time, as I talked about earlier. Now, there are 3 principles that we're going to apply in studying language change. The first is that we need to work with a community of speakers and we need to capture the diversity across that community. We need recordings of spontaneous speech, and we need to identify in those recordings linguistic features that show variability and that are measurable or countable. So I'm going to unpack each of these a little bit for you. So the community of speakers that I'm looking at come from Sydney. There are 2 reasons for this. The first is that the earlier recordings that I had access to were made in Sydney, so to capitalise on that. And second, because we know that change begins in major urban centres and will often spread out from there. So if we're interested in innovations to Australian English, then major urban centres is a good place to look. And I'll also say that in general, across Australia's major urban centres, people actually speak very similarly. So I am sure that almost all of what I say today from Sydney speakers would also apply in Brisbane, but you can certainly tell me if you think that there's something different going on up here. So we have a total of 220 speakers that I'm going to be presenting you data from, and these speakers have diverse social characteristics. So I've already talked about the age. We also have males and females. We have speakers representing different social classes, and we're using a 3-way distinction between middle class, upper working class and lower working class. And we have different ethnicities captured. So this includes Anglo-Celtic Australians, who we've defined as those whose parents and grandparents were born in Australia and they grew up in an English-speaking household. And we have Chinese and Greek Italian Australians, and these are 2nd-generation migrants, so they're all native speakers of Australian English, but they are the children of 1st-generation migrants from Hong Kong, Greece and Italy, respectively. The data that we look at are recordings of spontaneous speech, and we have used here the method of the sociolinguistic interview, which in particular records narratives of personal experience. So where people tell stories about their lives, or they talk about their families, or they describe games that they used to play as children, with the idea of having them speak without monitoring how they're speaking, so we can capture maximally natural patterns in their speech. And the data that I'll be talking from is some 115 hours of recordings and over 1 million words of speech. And finally, within that speech, we need to identify the features that we can test for change. So these we term linguistic variables, where there's different ways of saying something similar. And we need variables that are measurable or countable. So we're not just saying, oh gosh, these people sound a little bit different, but we can actually check the patterns of use of different forms. So we want to know whether all speakers use the different forms to the same degree and in the same way, or whether one group might use one form more or less. And to do that, we need to be able to count the coexisting forms. So I'm going to talk about 3 quite distinct linguistic variables and look at how they have changed over time. I'm going to talk about vowels in Australian English, word final ER, and then quotatives. So we'll begin with the vowels, and this is work that has been led by 2 postdoctoral fellows on the project, whose photos are up there, James Grama and Simon Gonzalez, and Ben Purser, who's been assisting greatly as a research assistant on the work. So here we're going to, for the vowels, we'll be studying across our 5 generations, and I'm going to begin by playing a clip of one of the elderly adults, so you can hear, and I think you'll notice that it does sound quite different from how we speak today. So this is Camilla, who was born in 1906 and was recorded at the age of 82.
My mother allowed the place to be used as a committee room, and I remember at one stage with Billy Hughes speaking on our balcony and having tomatoes and things thrown at him.
Now, I said I'm going to be looking at the vowels. I'm looking at a specific set of vowels, and these are the labels that we give to the vowels that I'm talking about. So the FLEECE vowel is that in committee and speaking, the FACE vowel as in place and stage, the PRICE vowel as in my and I, the mouth vowel as in allowed, and the GOAT vowel as in tomatoes and thrown. Yes, so I've marked out the words where those vowels are illustrated in red, and I'm going to play you some more clips, and I've marked out those vowels again in red so you can listen to see if you can hear changes over time in these specific vowels. So here's Belinda, who is a builder. She was born in a builder generation. She's not a builder, she's an office clerk. Born in 1939.
And you'd have to face away and count up to about 50 or 100. And the others would run and hide, and then you had to come and find them.
Okay, and here's Fiona, who is a baby boomer, recorded as a teenager.
Right down the very bottom end of that date, it's got the big grass area where the boys play football and soccer and, you know, playing and just like tackle chasing and all that.
And Annie, who is one of our younger speakers, she would be one of our Generation Z speakers.
But like I don't have the chance to get to know people really well. Like I don't know, I'm usually with kids or teens like the whole time.
Okay, so the reason why I have selected these vowels to look at is because they have been described as those which show the most variation in Australian English from the earliest studies of Australian English. So Mitchell and Delbridge's founding work in 1965 on the speech of Australian adolescents, where they recorded some 7,000 adolescents from across Australia, proposed that there was a continuum from broad vowels, which are those that are what we call non-standard, associated with low levels of education, working class, with cultivated vowels on the other end of the continuum, which is the kind of pronunciation that Nick was talking about when people were trying to emulate the British received pronunciation in Britain, and then in between general vowels. And this broad, general, cultivated continuum has been used quite a lot in the literature. So Barbara Horvath, in her 1985 study, examined this, and she argued that in fact there was a contraction of the continuum as more and more speakers were using general vowels and moving away from the ends of the continuum. And this has been confirmed in more recent research by Cox and colleagues, and is noted in what would be the most widely used textbook on phonetics in Australia by Cox and Fletcher. So as well as attracting the attention of linguists, the social difference between these vowels has also attracted attention in representations of Australians in the media, in particular in comedy, which can be a very good barometer of features that people are noting in speech. So a great example that I can see you're all of course familiar with is Kath and Kim, that was made in the 2000s and has recently had a resurgence thanks to being on Netflix. And this, I'm going to show you a clip with Trude and Prue, who are of course these quite upper class shop assistants, and an interaction with Kath and Kim, who are representing working class Australians that have reached a new level of affluence. And you can see that in this interaction their vowels are very nicely contrasted.
Right there. Are you just happy, Bronzy? Oi, oi, ha.
Okay, so I don't need to draw your attention to which vowel you're talking about. Okay, so how do we study vowels? Now, we don't study vowels today by listening, and typically by listening and noting what they sound like, which is what we've all just done here. Rather, we take acoustic measurements of the vowels, and we take these measurements based on resonances in the vocal tract that give a general indication of the position of the tongue in the mouth in terms of height and backness, which are the main features that determine what the vowel sounds like. So I'm going to take you now through a series of charts that are measurements that we have taken from our data, from some 40,000 tokens that we've examined in the data. And for each of these 5 vowels, I'm going to show you movement of position of the tongue in the mouth. And we'll begin with FLEECE. So this chart has the position of the tongue in the mouth on the vertical axis. So higher up is higher and fronter, and lower is lower and backer. So this is, higher is FLEECE, lower is FLEECE. That's the sort of difference that we're comparing. I'll play you real examples in a minute. The horizontal axis shows our different generations. So we've plotted the speakers according to year of birth. So as we move to the right, we move forward in time. And the lines represent class. So we've broken down the speakers according to their class. So the red line is middle class, the blue line upper working class, and the green line lower working class. And there's a number of changes that we can see here. First, we can see that over time we've had a shift towards higher and fronter vowels. And we can see that it's particularly so for the upper working class and the lower working class, whereas in fact the middle class have not moved so much. Which also tells us something else then, that the change is in the direction of the middle class. So people are moving towards these more prestige pronunciations. And we can also notice that we had in the, among the elderly, the earliest group we have here, we had quite a sharp class distinction, with the middle class producing much higher and fronter vowels than the upper working class and then the lower working class. And so I'm going to play you a couple of clips that will illustrate this. So first we'll hear Camilla, who was a seamstress, her father was a painter.
1918.
And then Dora, whose father was an accountant at the Schweppes factory.
1916.
So that's the very large difference that we're seeing in those, in the lines there. This class distinction continues up until the 1970s, and here we have 2 1970s teenagers, and again I think you'll be able to hear a clear difference in the vowels between Tammy, whose father was a labourer, and Evangeline, whose father was a surgeon.
Your knees, your knees.
And then today what we see is that the difference has very much diminished. The lines are much closer together. We've got much less of a class distinction today. And you can hopefully hear this in Jasmine and Anna's vowels. So Jasmine is a retail manager and Anna is a speech pathologist. And I'll draw your attention to pay attention to the E vowel. That's what we're interested in here, because there's another vowel that sounds very different, which is the next one that I'm going to talk about.
Teacher.
So the FLEECE vowel in both of those words is very similar, capturing this collapsing of class differences that we've seen. For FACE, we find something very similar. The same distinction for the elderly is retained. It's also retained for the 1970s adults, and I'll play you an example of them. So here we have Gregory, a meat deliverer, and Hugh, a doctor, and we're interested in the vowel in the word maid.
Salami. Mistakes are made.
Okay, so we can hear a difference between those vowels. And then once again, for the younger Australians, that difference has very much diminished. So here we have Reese, a carpet layer, and Jeremy, a school programs manager, and you'll hear that their vowels in place are much more similar.
Is place.
Okay, so that's the distinction, that's the change that we're looking at. And I'm not going to take you through all the vowels, because in fact they're all patterning very, very, very similarly. So for each of these 5 vowels, we have quite a marked class distinction for the elderly. That is generally retained for the baby boomers and Generation X. And then for the millennials, it's been very much diminished, such that we're having much less of a class distinction in these vowels by the young Australians today. Can also note that in each case, the change is towards middle class realisations, so towards a prestige norm. And although I haven't shown it here, the change is led by women, which is very often the case in these kinds of changes, as women tend to be more sensitive to measures of overt prestige. So as a final point on this variable, we might wonder what the migrant groups are doing. And I'm going to focus on the young group here. And I don't show it here, but I can tell you that the Italians are patterning very similarly to the Anglos. The Chinese, on the other hand, are a little bit different. So here I've added in the average pronunciations for the young Chinese compared with the Anglo-Australians. And you can see that for most vowels, the Chinese are either just above or just below the end of this change. So they're just slightly ahead of the change. They're just slightly more middle class than the middle class, is how we might interpret this. This is entirely consistent with the social nature of the speakers that we have recorded, which is actually representative of the second generation Chinese Australian community. This community, they're very well educated, they go to a lot of selective schools, they work in high status professions, and they live in quite wealthy areas. They are then using language to find their place in the community, and in doing that, they may in fact help to drive this change forward. So to sum up then with what we've seen for the vowels over time, we've seen diminishing class differences, we've seen large social differences among the earlier generations that are no longer evident in the millennials. And we've seen change in the direction of middle class pronunciations, which is movement towards a prestige standard. Why might this be the case? Well, one reason I think would be greater access to education that I talked about. This has been something of an equaliser in speech in society, and also possibly a weaker association with an Australian ochre identity, where Australians feel less of a need to draw on those very broad vowels to express their identity in urban centres, I will say. And we've also seen that change is adopted with rigour and possibly also advanced by Chinese Australians as they establish their place in Australian society. Okay, so moving on to variable number 2, which is word final ER. And again, this is work that has been led by James Grummer and Simon Gonzalez. And it's also a variable that once again Kath and Kim have cottoned onto in this famous clip.
What are you saying, Nicky? What? My marriage is over. O-V-A-H. Over.
So clearly, then there's some kind of social meaning that they're parodying there in this clip. This variable has also been attributed to migrants in comedy. So some of you will also remember the comedy company that was around in the 1980s, and Con the Fruiterer. This was evident in his speech. His sort of catchphrase, "a couple of days, beautiful, doesn't matter," was also this very long ER. This association with the migrant community has also been noted by linguists, and it's been described as being, this ER has been noted as being characteristic of particularly young Greek Australians, and the very well-known Australian sociolinguist noted or described this different pronunciation of ER as one of the most conspicuous phonological features of the Greek ethnolect. So what's happened over time? So for this feature, we're going to focus on 4 age groups: adults, teens, recorded in the 1970s and 80s, and adults and young adults recorded today. And we're going to also draw a little bit more on the ethnic minorities that we've recorded. So from the teenagers, now we'll be looking at Anglo, Italian and Greek Australians, which were what was included in Barbara Horvath's study, of course, as the major migrant groups of the time. For the adults recorded today, we have Anglo and Italian Australians, and for the young adults, we have Anglo, Italian and Chinese Australians. So unfortunately, we have no Greek Australians as yet that I'm able to report to you on, and it will be a burning question, as you'll see, what they're doing today. For Chinese Australians, we only have the youngest group because of their migration history. There simply wasn't a large community of second generation Chinese prior to this age group. So again, we'll listen to some examples so you can get a feel for the variable. So here is Ruth, who is adult, recorded in the 1970s.
But it was great to see you collect those marbles. I remember most of my brother was the marble collector.
Okay, and here is a young Australian, a Chinese Australian in this case.
Like a lot of times patients can't speak Cantonese, or they can't speak English, sorry, and like the doctor is not able to speak it either, and they've got no other person around, and they can't get an interpreter. The last resort is to get the class to go and translate.
Okay, so that's the variable that we're looking at. Let me also draw your attention to the fact that the data are transcribed in intonation units, which is a stretch of speech that occurs under a coherent intonation contour, and each line here represents a distinct intonation unit. And ER can occur at the end of an intonation unit or at the end of a line, but it can also occur in the middle, as in other that I've circled there, and this is relevant to the change that we see, as you'll see. So whereas for the vowels that we just looked at, we looked at vowel quality, the height and backness of the tongue in the mouth. Here we're going to focus on duration, so the length of ER. So the vertical axis in this chart represents duration. The higher up, the longer ER is. And the horizontal axis represents the time periods moving towards the present. And the colour represents intonation unit position. So the dark blue is final position and the light blue is in the middle of the intonation unit. And you can see there that ER is always longer at the end of the intonation unit, which is exactly what we would expect. And you can hear that difference here with a couple of examples from a young Greek-Australian teenager recorded in the 1970s. So final.
She was a terrific teacher. She was a terrific teacher. And sometimes the teacher caught them. And sometimes the teacher caught them.
So hopefully you can notice that it's longer in final position, which is exactly what we would expect. But what we wouldn't necessarily expect is that we have lengthening going on this form over time, but only in final position. So you can see that the dark blue boxes gradually get higher over time and the medial position is relatively stable. So this is then the locus of change, and this is an important point to make because it illustrates that these speakers aren't just willy-nilly lengthening ER because they don't know what to do with it. They're quite systematic in where they will do it. There are constraints on where they will do it. All right, so how has this change spread through the community? Here I've essentially reproduced the same chart, but now we've broken down each age group for ethnicity. So Anglos are represented there in orange, Italians in yellow, Greeks in purple, and Chinese in light purple. And if we compare how these different groups pattern over time, we see something very interesting. So for the 1970s teenagers, if you remember, we saw lengthening from this age group, we find that it's actually the Greek Australians who were lengthening. The Anglo and Italian Australians have moved very little at this time point. So this was first tapped into by the Greek Australians, which is exactly what Con the Fruiterer was, of course, doing. For the 2010s adults, for which we just have Anglos and Italians, we can see that they have lengthened at this point. And although not shown here, I can tell you that that lengthening is particularly the case for working class females who are leading this change at that point. And then today, what we find is that all of the three communities that we have are able to report on, Anglos, Italians and Chinese, have all lengthened such that they're now all a similar length to the Greek Australians of the 1970s. Of course, we wonder what on earth the Greek are doing today, and we look forward to be able to tell you about that. But nevertheless, what we would see here is we would see a change that was first taken off by the Greek Australians and today has been largely adopted across the community. So to summarise then what we see from this variable, we've seen lengthening in final position only, not across the board. We first observe it in Greek Australians in the 1970s. It was then adopted by lower working class adult women in the 2010s, and today it's been adopted across the community. Different from the previous variable that we looked at where we saw change towards middle class variants, in this case we've got a working class variant taking over. So it's a change away from a prestige standard, which we would say is probably happening below the level of consciousness. People probably aren't aware that they're doing this. So why might this be the case? Why might we all be copying what the Greek Australians were doing? Well, it has been proposed that ethnic communities can play a role in leading change, and this has been proposed from work conducted in London and in Sweden and in Toronto. And one of the ideas is that these ethnic minorities may have quite diverse networks, and with a diverse network it's easier for the change to spread out further because you're interacting with more people. So that's certainly one possibility. Another possibility is that they are tapping into changes that are already latent in society that we may not have observed in the data, but that they're tapping into these changes and being early adopters of these changes. So possibly because they're differentiating themselves from their accented parents, which is what Barbara Horvath proposed, that they're trying to sound more like their peers, or also possibly because they have less access to an Anglo-adult model because their parents don't speak that Anglo-Australian English. So they're more susceptible then to the patterns that are around them and may advance them in that way. So the final variable that I'm going to talk about is quotatives, and here I'd like to acknowledge the help of Cale Johnson and Esther Lee, who is currently doing her honours thesis on this topic. So quotatives are forms that are used to introduce direct speech, and unlike the other variables that we've looked at, in this case we have a set of multiple forms that sort of compete in the space of introducing direct speech. And also, unlike the vowels and ER, which are changes that are specific to Australian English, in this case we're talking about changes that are actually occurring across varieties of English. And in particular, we've seen the introduction and very rapid spread of the use of be like from the 1980s across varieties of English. So I'm going to look at the same for age groups that we looked at for ER, and I'll again play you some examples to familiarise yourselves, so you can familiarise yourselves with the variable. So here we have Brittany, as it was recorded as an adult in the 1970s, so one of the builders, using say to introduce direct speech.
You take this bill and someone say, I'll give one of these green ones or multicoloured ones.
Okay, so using say. Here we have a 1970s teenager, so one of the baby boomers, using two forms, go, and then what we call a zero quotative, where there's no explicit form, but they just launch into the direct speech.
She goes, it's my ankle 44, and we have to say, oh yeah, tell me what is it? And she told us.
And then a millennial using the ubiquitous be like.
But also it's the first one, so like, they're like, oh, it's uni, like, come watch the show with us. They're just like children now, and I was like, my dad, I have to.
Okay, so what do we see with these forms? So in this graph, I've charted the percentage of use of the different forms over time. So again, the horizontal axis is time period. In this case, the vertical axis represents the percentage of all quotatives that that particular form represents. This is a big mess. It's very hard to make sense of it, so let me try to clear it up a bit for you. So first of all, just talking about two forms that I didn't mention. One is the use of think to introduce direct speech, and also other. For example, if somebody says, and he yelled out, what are you doing? We would classify that as other. And you can see that these two forms are very much minor variants. They hover at around 10%, go up and down a little bit, but not really a lot to say about those forms. So we'll concentrate more here on say in blue and the zero form in pink. And what we see here very clearly is that the use of both of these decline over time. So say accounted for over half of the quotatives of our builders, and zero was used about a quarter of the time. Today, they're both reduced to under 10% each. So if this is the case, other forms have obviously come in to take their place. And in the 1970s, the form that came in was go, as we heard earlier. So this, as you can see here, is a term that was used quite a lot by the 1970s teenagers and 2010s adults. And not shown here, I can tell you that in particular it was associated with lower working and upper working class males, and in particular the Italian and Greek Australians were leading in the use of go. Linguistically, we also notice that it's used in particular in a specific context in what we call the historical present, which is where we use a present tense to talk about something in the past, as in the example that we just heard, just telling a past narrative and saying he goes. Very rarely do people say he went. They use the he goes form a lot. And it's possible that this form then, with the historical present, has a certain vividness, so it's a particularly useful narrative device, and that might explain why it came in. So I'm making that point again to make the point that it's not people willy-nilly using these random forms. They serve a particular purpose and they're used in somewhat constrained ways. And I also have my final draw on comedy for you. Kylie Mole, also from the Comedy Company, was one of the great proponents of go as one of her catchphrases.
And guess what? He comes over and he goes, sorry, I just couldn't help staring. And I'll go, oh, it's okay, it happens all the time. And he goes, nah, your dress is caught up in your undies.
Okay, so you can also hear, along with her use of go, a lot of non-standard features in her speech, which is then representing the association of go at that time. As we know though, or as if you didn't know, you know now, go lived a short life. It was not retained because Be Like came in and essentially took over the system. So for the 2010s adults, Be Like accounts for about just under 10% of the quotatives. And in particular, we find Be Like for this group associated with middle and upper working class females. And in particular, in quite a constrained linguistic environment used to represent inner thought. So not something that somebody actually said, but a reaction or something like that. So as in this example from Annette.
Then things positive, that's like, woohoo.
And it's proposed that this is the way that Be Like came into the language. It's an excellent device for reporting something like this, where you're not reporting exactly what somebody said, but you're approximating what that might have meant. So somehow, for the 2010s, the Millennials, this form has taken off entirely, and in these data, it's representing some 70% of all of their quotatives. So it's used almost to the exclusion of all other forms, which is very, very rapid change. Also, lastly, we'll say a little bit about ethnicity for this variable. So these three charts show young Anglo-Australians, Italian Australians and Chinese Australians, with each bar representing a different speaker, and the females are in green and the males are in blue, not in blue, are in yellow. And you can see that each of the ethnic groups uses Be Like to a similar degree. For each group, it ranges from about 25% of the time for the lowest users to 97% of the time for the highest users. But there are some differences for gender. So for young Anglo-Australians, we see that the highest users are almost all females. The lowest users has a combination of females and males. For the Italians, we see a slightly more marked gender distinction. The highest users are all females and the lowest users are all males. For the Chinese, we have no such gender distinction. You can see that the yellow and green bars are fairly evenly scattered across the way. And once again, this is entirely consistent with the middle class orientation of this group, where they're using more these female prestige forms, and the males are doing that as well. So to sum up then, what we've seen for the quotatives over time, we've seen a rapid restructuring of a system. While the builders used say and zero, the Generation X's teenagers used say, zero and go, as did the adults, but with the adults, Be Like was just starting to sneak in, or is just starting to sneak in, and the Millennials have shifted all of that to Be Like. The leaders in change of these variables differ. So Go was led by working class males and migrant groups, and Be Like was led by middle class females. So we've got these changes coming from different directions. And we can also say that this is parallel to changes taking place across the English-speaking world, which may play a role in the rapidity with which it has taken place. We can also note that unlike the vowels that we've looked at, these quotatives draw on a specific word or a lexical form, which is much more salient and so much easier for people to notice and then perhaps introduce more rapidly. So what have we seen then about language change over time? We've seen that change takes place via variation as different forms coexist. Change can be led by different social groups. So we've seen that for the vowels and the quotative Be Like, we have what we could describe as change from above. It is something that people are possibly consciously aware of and they're approximating. It's coming in from prestige forms. With lengthening of ER and quotative go, we have the opposite. We have what we could describe as a change from below, where it's coming from lower working class males, migrant groups, and is probably something that is below the level of consciousness. We've also seen systematicity in the ways in which the changes spread through the system in terms of both the way they spread through the community and through the linguistic system, which I hope goes some way to counter negative evaluations of language change as people just being lazy or ignoring grammar and threatening the survival of English, the kind of comments that we talked about earlier. And this is particularly important because these comments are not just restricted to language purists. They are in fact much more widely held, even if we're not consciously aware of them. And this is what leads to linguistic discrimination, which we know exists because it has been demonstrated that even brief samples of speech varieties associated with low prestige groups can cue negative attributions regarding individual speakers. And there's extensive experimental work, both overseas but also in Australia, demonstrating this, that non-standard forms, more sort of working class pronunciations, might be ranked high on solidarity dimensions. When people are asked to listen to a clip and rate the speaker, they might find these non-standard speakers using a lot of non-standard forms to be higher in friendliness or generosity or attractiveness, which is fine, but they tend to rate them lower on status dimensions. So listening to these non-standard forms, people typically will note that these speakers are low in education, in intelligence, in competence, in credibility, in reliability, and in employability. So obviously having very strong implications and affecting the access that such speakers have to different aspects of society. So Pillar has summarised this very nicely when she notes that white native speakers of prestige varieties of English are privileged to live with the illusion that their accents are neutral, standard, and natural. And I hope that with a better understanding of variation, we can help combat linguistic discrimination, that we can accept and recognise that there can be more than one way of expressing similar ideas, that speakers' choice of different forms will be impacted by multiple factors, but not their intelligence or their employability, but things such as obviously the time that they live in, but also the social network, who they're interacting with, and the identity that they might want to put forward. And we also need to accept that over time, variation can lead to language change, and so what is considered a prestige norm is not a fixed construct, but that itself will also change over time and is actually something much more ephemeral and transient than some might like to believe. So thank you, and I'd like to also thank the team who have helped support this research.